Hello and welcome to this 100% essay. It comes from Michael Chockler, who interestingly says he's giving it to me and to you as an appreciation for the help my videos gave him during the time in which I was forced to study English literature at school. So I love the fact that he's got full marks, even though he obviously didn't like the subject very much. Here is your title. How are you going to learn best from this? I'm going to use the essay to teach you the 7 most important skills of essay writing which guarantee you top grades. I'm going to show you the full essay, one section at a time, with my examiner's commentary on the left-hand side, which is going to help you make sense of the AQA mark scheme. Number 1 on my list of skills was a 3-part thesis, and Michael's gone overboard and given you a 4-part thesis. And by the way, you can steal any ideas and language you want from this essay to learn for yourself. Stevenson presents good and evil in Jekyll and Hyde as a natural component of man that should be understood, that's his first point, rather than something that should hold society inmate to its Christian afflictions. Second point. In the extract, Dr. Jekyll is uncovering to the reader these ideas, and finally, after 9 chapters of repression, he lets go and unleashes his liberated self. Stevenson aims to use Jekyll's findings about good and evil to remind his readership of innate duality, point 3, and the importance of exploring man's more sinister side, point 4. Now you'll see that I've highlighted words in bold. Those are the subject terminology, the appropriate vocabulary that you need to use about literature essays. Steal these as you go through. And then in italics in each paragraph you'll see where I've highlighted the context, and you can see Michael drops that context in like embedded quotations rather than just giving you a big chunk of context that doesn't really help the essay. Now, the brilliant advantage of writing a thesis like this is that it becomes your essay plan. All he has to do now is prove those 4 ideas and he's got a top grade essay. Good and evil in the extract and the novella as a whole is presented as a natural component of man. Notice how he's linking the extract to the novel right from the beginning. In the extract, Stevenson aims to emphasise to a reader that though Dr. Jekyll is transforming, what he becomes is not only as human, but also as monstrous as the former. So now he's arguing that mankind, is just as monstrous as Hyde. He does this by having Jekyll describe the feeling of being Hyde as natural and human. Hyde's actions throughout the novella are murderous, violent and unpredictable, so for Stevenson to describe him in ways as human and relatable indicates Stevenson's change of perspective, as he previously presents evil as sinister, but begins to depict it as innate, exhibiting a view that is more sympathetic towards Hyde. So you can see how he's used a quotation from the extract to talk about the rest of the novel. That's a brilliant skill to show the examiner you're writing about the whole novel and building an argument, rather than just writing loads about the extract and then separately writing loads about the rest of the novel, which doesn't create an argument and makes it difficult for you to be conceptualized. I'd argue it makes it impossible. Now we have a detailed development about that same quotation, describing Hyde as natural and human. Each of the adjectives connotes normality about Hyde and reinforces Stevenson's aims to be in the direction of normalising the evil which the character personifies throughout the novella. You can see that he's constantly coming back to Stevenson's purpose, which means his answer will always be in the top band. Dr. Jekyll admits that this too was myself, cementing an impression of unexpected humanity about Hyde. The comment about punctuation here is a bit over the top, so I'm skipping it. Jekyll has manifested all of his evil into the creation of another being, but feels none the less human because of it. So he's making a sophisticated argument here that we shouldn't criticise evil as the worst aspect of humanity. We should treat it sympathetically because it is a natural aspect of humanity. It's going to be difficult to make this stick, isn't it? So let's see how he tries to prove it. Stevenson continues this impression throughout the rest of the chapter. Man is not truly one, but two, presenting each side of duality to be just one, rendering them synonymous in worth to each other. So he's saying good and evil are equally balanced and therefore equally valued. Interesting. Stevenson is depicting the duality of man to be inherently balanced, calling recognition upon the monster that lies within, deviating from other Gothic writers at the time who wrote about external, inhuman monsters, such as Mary Shelley when she wrote Frankenstein earlier in the 19th century. So this is a really sophisticated point I hadn't really thought about, how Stevenson is having a conversation with Gothic writers from earlier in the century. And he's arguing that those Gothic monsters weren't fully human, whereas Stevenson has decided that Hyde is fully human, that the monster is within us all. Stevenson is developing a Gothic trope in a way that no other writers during his time dared to, adding thought-provoking memorability to the message he's sending. He ultimately pushes forward the idea that good and evil should be seen as, in an ideal society, essential and normal parts of humanity. So this is now a convincing exploration of the context, isn't it? And you can steal that idea and drop it into any essay on Jekyll and on Hyde. Because you will discuss the duality of man about both of those characters, and the reference to Mary Shelley and Frankenstein would be appropriate. The next paragraph is slightly weaker, which is why I've said it's thoughtful rather than convincing. Because Michael comes up with a really interesting idea, but leaves it as a general rather than specific. Let's see what I mean. Good and evil is presented as a topic that should be explored further. Well, to be specific, you'd say why, and what's the outcome of that exploration going to be? Michael doesn't do that, so this is a less successful part of his argument. This is shown in the extract when Dr. Jekyll says, "He must here speak by theory alone, saying not that which he knows, but that which he supposes to be most probable." Jekyll is giving a long and hollow explanation of his Anagnorisis, reminding the reader that even Jekyll is unsure of any exact details behind good and evil. So it's absolutely fine for the character to be unsure of the details, but then you'd have to explain why the author might also be unsure, or explain why the author is sure and is pointing you towards one particular interpretation. And just in case you didn't know what Anagnorisis was, I didn't. I had to look it up. It's when the principal character discovers another character's true identity, or the true nature of their own circumstances. So Jekyll here is discovering more about his own identity. This vocabulary isn't what gave him the grade 9, but it's still something you can steal. In this paragraph, Michael is going to deal with the idea that Jekyll is an unreliable narrator, which is great, but to make it brilliant, he'd really need to link this to Stevenson's purpose. Why does he make him unreliable? The use of an unreliable narrator could prove frustrating to a reader, as even after 9 chapters of mystery, they are still kept in the dark about what really happens to Jekyll when he swallows the transforming draught. This lack of understanding is also prevalent at the start of the novella, with Enfield telling Utterson he never saw a man he so disliked, and yet he scarce knows why. Those who interact with Hyde feel strong yet inexplicable emotions towards him, teasing the reader's fascination of Hyde and his still enigmatic character. So there's a hint that it's actually just to hook the reader and grip them and keep them struggling to the end to find out the answer to the mystery. But rather than hint, Michael could be explicit. This would be a good time to jump into the mark scheme to show you why the essay still got top marks, even though it's not always convincing. In the top of the level, you need to have a convincing exploration of one or more ideas, perspectives, or contextual factors. Now you can see that he's been convincing about more than one idea. At the bottom of grades 8 and 9, you only have to start to demonstrate elements of exploring these ideas. So although not every single point is convincing and critical, taken together, the essay certainly is. In fact, if you make sure that everything you write is at least thoughtful and developed, when you put all those thoughtful and developed ideas together, you have a convincing argument. Hey presto, top grades. In the next paragraph, Michael is going to show us why Stevenson wanted an unreliable narrator, and he signposts that with alternatively, which proves to the examiner that he's exploring interpretations and ideas. It's a really useful trick. Alternatively, this could be Stevenson's way of drawing upon his Victorian readers' fear of the unknown and scientific advancement, as Jekyll is a scientist who is investigating good and evil, but is ultimately left uncertain. By leaving Hyde in the light of mystery throughout the novella, Stevenson links the reader's fear of him to a contemporary fear of the unknown. Therefore, Stevenson presents good and evil in a light of frustrating mystery, remedying the reader of their naivety of the subject and encouraging them to try and find out more. So interestingly, I wrote about this that it's almost convincing, and now I've read it a second time, I'm more convinced. In the next 2 paragraphs, Michael is going to argue 2 alternative interpretations again. One interpretation here, and then we'll get that word alternatively again to introduce the real interpretation that he favours. And that's a really good trick. Give a really good argument in your first paragraph, and then counter-argument, the one you really believe in, comes second. Finally, Stevenson presents good and evil in the novella as physical traits. In the extract, Hyde is described to be an advocate of deformity and decay. This describes physical features of Hyde's character, and not only dehumanises him, but juxtaposes his image with the quintessentially good Dr. Jekyll. So he's arguing that there is a deliberate physical contrast between Jekyll and Hyde. This is because Jekyll is described earlier in the story to be a large, well-made, smooth-faced man, with large having connotations of prosperity, smooth-faced having connotations of a civilized gentleman, and man emphasizing how noticeable his humanity is just from his appearance. Now, I love the way that Michael has analysed each part of this quotation, but hasn't treated this as a quote exploder where he's written 200 words about that quotation. He's made it as economic and efficient as possible, and this is a really brilliant skill. Your interpretations about quotations don't have to be massive. They just have to link back to your thesis at the beginning. Alternatively, this could be Stevenson's way of criticising modern civility standards. While deformity and decay have surface connotations of neglect, they are natural features of humans, with the dental alliteration between the two hinting at there being more to their meaning and linking the 2 words together. You don't have to know that it's dental, by the way. Well made could also be Stevenson's way of relating Jekyll's surface image to a mask which he uses to hide Hyde. Nice one. Stevenson is manipulating the fact that superficially these words make Hyde seem more immoral, exploiting Victorian society's inclination to pseudosciences that stipulated morality through appearance, exploiting Victorian society's inclination to pseudosciences that stipulated morality through appearance, such as Lombroso's theory of atavism, which dictated that criminals can be recognised from atavistic physical features. Okay, that's a massive chunk of context. So what? He hasn't yet made a point about why Stevenson is interested in how society views physical appearance in this way. And so in the next paragraph he tells us why, becomes fully convincing. Stevenson is using society's expectations of good and evil to show it that appearance cannot denote either, and that one's morality can only be identified by actions rather than how they might present themselves. This presents good and evil as a point of criticism from Stevenson to his readership, allowing Stevenson to subtly reach an audience from a didactic angle. That means he's in the role of teacher, showing his readership that everyone is really a monster, even those hiding behind well-made masks. So that's a brilliantly crafted paragraph, and it comes back to that original quote we had in the previous paragraph. Now, in many ways, the essay could have ended there because it's ended with Stevenson's final purpose, but Michael has a more detailed conclusion in mind. In conclusion, good and evil in Jekyll and Hyde are presented as innate and unexplored aspects of human nature. Stevenson presents evil as an inescapable human trait in the novella, in spite of Victorian society's emphasis on the importance of civility and reputation. He didn't need zeitgeist-like. Stevenson exploits his readers' expectations and their fear of the unknown in order to make them re-examine the relationship between good and evil in society that they've been taught their whole lives to be invariable. This indicates that Stevenson believed both elements exist within everyone and that evil should be understood rather than denied or superimposed by good, as it was in late Victorian society. Notice how his final interpretation always comes back to the context, to Victorian society, and just using the word society throughout your essay is an easy way to prove to the examiner you're considering the author's purpose, and therefore you're coming up with valid interpretations. Now, if I zoom out, you can see how the quotations are always embedded, which means they fit into each sentence. And you'll notice that he's not really writing in P paragraphs, by which I mean there isn't a separate sentence explaining the quotation. The explanation is in the sentence with the quotation a lot of the time. He's writing P sentences. The other thing to notice is that there is some italics in nearly every paragraph, these little bits of context dropped in, like embedded quotations. Another brilliant lesson to learn from Michael here is that he wrote the essay under time conditions. This is what he says: "The way assessments worked at my old school was that we were informed of the question, then given a couple of lessons to prepare a response, and then given a lesson of silent assessment where we would write it out and submit it. So this was a tag, teacher assessed grade, which is what all of you will be doing now in case exams are cancelled, but it's also a fantastic way to revise." So he spent 2 hours writing it in those couple of lessons, then he's memorised it by writing it and presumably looking at it at home, and then he's come in and written it again from memory. That is perfect revision, not by studying quotes and not by reading, but by actually writing a full essay. Let's review those 7 skills that give you the top grades. You've seen a 3-part thesis. In fact, he had a 4-part. You could see that each paragraph referred back to an idea in the thesis. I've shown you how his quotations were embedded. He doesn't write about the characters as real people, but as a way to put forward Stevenson's point of view. You got that sense all the way through the essay. That viewpoint is nearly always explained, and you can see how he skillfully moved from the extract to the whole text, often in the same paragraph. Now, in point 7, I've written the conclusion should include an interpretation of the ending. There are 2 reasons I've said this. First, it's really easy to write a conclusion that just repeats everything you wrote in your first paragraph, and so you might as well not have written it. Secondly, the ending is where you get the author's final point of view, so there will always be something interesting to say about how he wants to affect the reader based on how the text ends. So if we go back to Michael's conclusion, he argues that Stevenson presents evil as an inescapable human trait in the novella. And he could prove that at the end, because Jekyll cannot escape the evil of Hyde, which is why Jekyll dies first. He gets subsumed by Hyde because he can no longer turn back into Jekyll, and then Hyde dies last, having already, if you like, triumphed over Jekyll's mixture of good and evil. And that shows how Jekyll could not escape Hyde, just as mankind can't escape his own or her own human nature. Then he argues that Stevenson does this to show that evil should be understood, and at the end we can ask, does Jekyll try to understand Hyde? Yes, he does. He has that line about pitying him. And the ending will always do this for you. It will always give you access to a new perspective which you can put in your conclusion. And a third advantage of that is that we're all influenced much more by beginnings and ends than by the middle. So if your ending, your conclusion is awesome, you're much more likely to get a great mark. Simple psychology. Now, you've probably realised just reading 3 or 4 of these top grade essays on my channel could be fantastic for your revision. So, another top grade essay coming up now.